Now, imagine this. It's 1943. You're a German soldier on the Eastern Front, and you haven't slept in 3 days. Not because of artillery, not because of ground assaults, but because of a sound. Because as soon as you hear that soft swooshing, you know you have maybe a few seconds before bombs start dropping and all hell breaks loose. And it could come from anywhere at any time. German soldiers called them the Nachthexen, a cynical word meant for night witches. The Night Witches were a Soviet aerial regiment. They were so terrifying that if a Nazi soldier managed against all odds to shoot just one down, they would automatically earn an Iron Cross, one of the highest honors in the Nazi military. It was bad enough that a rumor was starting to spread among the German soldiers that the enemy pilots had been injected with some unknown chemical cocktail to give them supernatural Nazi killing skills. That was literally a rumor that was being spread amongst the camp. So what else? Well, if you're me, you're probably thinking it must have been what they were flying. Something so technologically advanced at the time, it had unrivaled speed and agility, equipped only with the most devastating machine guns and bombs, right? But you'd be wrong. This is what they were flying, a humble crop duster known as the PO-2. And it would become the Soviets' unlikely secret weapon. And all that held it together was wood, fabric, and honestly, prayers. And it wasn't fast either. Max speed was 94 miles per hour, which honestly is slower than my dad driving down the highway, but that's besides the point. While most planes of that era were equipped with radars, radio, and parachutes, the PO-2 had none of that. It wasn't shiny and by no means was a decisive battle winner. This little plane was more remarkable than revolutionary. You see, before the war, it wasn't just used in agriculture. There were actually several different models of the PO-2, each serving a very specific purpose. One version had 3 cockpits built for the national airline Aeroplan as a mail and passenger carrier. Another was designed for photographers conducting geographical surveys, while another served as an emergency transport. There was even one for artillery observation and recon, fitted with a loudspeaker to address enemy troops on the ground. So what truly made this machine remarkable was its ability to adapt to a wide variety of tasks over a long period of time. But when it came to warfare, the PO-2 was pretty limited compared to all the other warplanes of the time. It could only carry 2 bombs, but somehow the Soviets turned it into not only a weapon of destruction, but used it to unleash psychological warfare on their enemies. And the people who were flying it have been all but forgotten and erased from history. That is, until today. Now, before we get into the story of the Night Witches, I first want to talk about this plane, because it really paints the picture of what the regiment flying them had to go through. Because on paper, this thing should have been a death trap, even for the most daring, experienced pilots. It should have been totally disregarded for military use. Now, the PO-2 wasn't just not fast, it was slow, comically slow. But this unusually slow speed ended up being a key reason to its success in battle, and what made it not so comical to the Germans. The state-of-the-art flown by the Germans at the time would stall at around 120 miles per hour, while our little friend here, remember, reached a top speed of 94 miles per hour. This meant anytime the German fighters got close enough to open fire on the PO-2s, they'd only have a few seconds before either zooming straight past them or stalling out and crashing. The Germans quite literally couldn't slow down enough to shoot at the Soviets effectively without falling out of the sky. So I guess it turns out that sometimes being the slowest in the race actually does pay off. But anyway, just picture it, because you're a German fighter pilot flying some of the latest and greatest planes in the world. You find your target and close in. Not wanting to waste precious ammo, you carefully take aim before finally you fire. But instead of annihilating the enemy, the whiplash annihilates your neck. You're simply too fast for the problem you're trying to solve. But it gets even better. For the Russians, that is, not so much the Germans. In the 1940s, radar systems were designed to detect metal. So as soon as you enter enemy territory, well, you expect to be expected, right? Not if you're a plane made from plywood and fabric wings. It was practically invisible to radar. Electronics were no use. Your only chance was if you were lucky enough to spot them in the middle of the night, flying quietly below 1,000 feet. Now, all of that would surely be enough to keep anyone on their toes. But the plane had another trick up its sleeve, one that seemed like just another major flaw, but in reality, it made it even more deadly. See, the engine powering the PO2 was just a 5-cylinder radial, capable of maybe putting out 125 horsepower on a good day. It even earned nicknames from the Soviets themselves, names like sewing machine and coffee mill. So it's not the stealth machine either. So how did the Night Witches pilot their little clankers around this, well, not so little noise problem? It was actually quite inventive. You see, once they were near their target, instead of ramping up their power, they would kill their engine and simply glide over their target. The only sound that could be heard from the ground was wind whistling through the wings. German soldiers actually recounted the sound being like a witch's broomstick cutting through the air. So again, they call them Nachthexen. Night Witches. Now sure, even just the bombs the Night Witches dropped were devastating. I mean, 23,000 tons of devastation to be exact. But an even greater strength of the Night Witches was their strategy. Flying in teams of 3, 2 PO2s would act as decoys, making lots of noise with their engines, clanking at full throttle, dropping flares, doing anything by all means to draw the Germans' attention. Meanwhile, a third plane would cut its engine and glide in from a seemingly random but strategically chosen location just above the tree line. They would then locate their target, aim, and release their bombs. Then they'd rotate, with the bomber now becoming the new decoy as someone else would then glide in, over and over and over all night long, each plane carrying a small crew of 2, just a pilot and a navigator. And these crews would fly between 8 and 18 missions per night, and even sometimes more. They do one run, reload back at base camp, and go back out for another round. Now this is important because being such a small plane, the PO2's range was only about 390 miles. This meant most of the bases where they'd go to refuel had to be very close to the front lines, sometimes within range of German artillery. So how would you get around this? You're quite literally based near the German front lines. Well, the short answer is
you do the exact same thing you are doing already.
You see, the Soviets kept up to 40 crews in the air simultaneously, with no way to predict when and where they would be. The Germans were kept very busy in a relentless game of whack-a-mole. But hang on, because even if there were 40 of these PO2s zooming around like angry mosquitoes, surely not being able to fly that far and having pretty limited weapons meant there was no chance they could overwhelm the Germans, right? Well, as it turns out, the magic wasn't just in the potion, it was also in the ritual. You see, the Soviets had learned from their own NKVD interrogation tactics that you don't break people with one blow. You break them by never letting them sleep. Over the course of the war, the Night Witches flew between 23,000 and 30,000 missions. They targeted everything under the sun, or at least in this case, the moon. They targeted logistical warfare targets, things like supply depots, ammunition stores, railway junctions, and river crossings. These are what keeps an army moving. If a fuel tank gets destroyed, now 100 tanks can't advance. Blow up a bridge, supplies being delivered suddenly get stuck. But by going beyond just logistical targets and instead opting for psychological torture, the Soviets could inflict a more unique form of damage on the Germans, one so insidious that to them it seemed to come from beyond the natural world. There was no way of knowing when the Night Witches' attacks would come, which meant the Germans were under constant anxiety, constant stress, and unlike most of us who are not currently in a battle, thankfully, and instead blessed by modern-day conveniences like melatonin gummies, the Germans had no way of repelling this invisible assault. So, night after sleepless night, the German soldiers, still clinging to life, would often descend into madness. So this begs the question, who would fly these planes? I mean, who in their right mind would choose to fly up to 18 missions a night in a plane made of wood and canvas in the freezing cold darkness without a parachute and often right outside the enemy's front door? As it turns out, women. Specifically young Soviet women, most of them in their teens to early 20s, and that wasn't an accident. This is the point in the story where I want you to meet Marina Ryskova. If you've never heard of her, you're not alone, but back in the Soviet Union in 1941, she was one of the most famous people in the country. Born in 1912, Marina joined the Soviet Air Force in 1933, and just 1 year later, she became the first woman to qualify as an aviation manager. After becoming a pilot at just 22, Marina joined the Zhukovsky Air Academy as their first female flight instructor. Getting a teaching position there was basically the Russian flying school equivalent of getting tenure at MIT, and she was just 22. Throughout the 1930s, she set various records for long-distance flying. Soon, she was even dubbed the Soviet Amelia Earhart, and her already impressive reputation would ultimately lead her to a rare and significant opportunity. You see, in the summer of 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. This was their now infamous attack on the Soviet Union. Over 3 million German soldiers were stationed along a north-south stretch of 1,800 miles. It would go down in history as the largest military operation ever. And well, honestly, the Soviets weren't good at this. Millions were being wounded, hundreds of thousands killed. And this is the point where Marina Ryskova started receiving mass amounts of letters from women all across the USSR, begging to be let into the ring and join the fight to defend their motherland. Ryskova took these letters to Stalin, knowing he admired her achievements and celebrity status. They both saw an opportunity. Now, first, let's be clear about something, because Stalin wasn't a feminist. On the surface, the Soviet Union was committed to gender equality in various ways. Women could get an education, they could work, even hold certain positions of authority. But this had nothing to do with ideology. It was purely pragmatic.
Meaning, if the state needed workers, then women worked. And when it needed mothers, women were mothers.
And now, as Soviet efforts to resist the German onslaught were failing, they realized they needed all the wartime help it could get. Now, before this, women were barred from the Soviet Air Force by the USSR. But because Marina Ryskova was one of the few women in Stalin's ear, she was one of the even fewer able to walk straight into his office and request that women pilots be allowed to join the fight. And surprisingly, Stalin said yes. Despite the reasons behind this decision, it not only put Soviet society well ahead of the rest of the world, it finally provided them with a desperately needed chance for survival. So on October 8th, 1941, Stalin issued Order 0099. 3 all-female aviation regiments were created, made up of 1,200 women in total. This included the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment. They were fast, maneuverable, and scrappy. They were perfect for aerial combat, aka dogfighting. Then there was the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, whose powerful weaponry was ideal for precision strikes. But these two units would inevitably require the integration of male pilots and crew. But not the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, an all-female unit flying slow, rattling crop dusters, seemingly the unlikeliest of heroes, enter the Night Witches. Men were still involved with the usual maintenance and upkeep, but the crew was entirely women from start to the end of the war. It was a first not only for the Soviet Union, but the world. From day one, this aerial coven was led by Major Yevdokia Bershinskaya, all the way until Germany surrendered. She was strict, demanding, and fiercely protective of her pilots. Meanwhile, Marina Ryskova commanded the 587th Regiment until her death in 1943, when her plane crashed during a mission in bad weather. Her time in battle and, unfortunately, on Earth ended when she was just 30 years old. But it was because of what she started that the 588th kept flying. And the women in these regiments weren't just good pilots. They brought a rich set of skills that the war enabled them to utilize. Some were brilliant professors, doctors, while others were skilled factory workers. No matter their background, when the call of duty came, they put it all aside to join the fight. And because this was such a landmark moment for women, the pressure was on. These women had something to prove that male pilots at the time did not. They knew they couldn't afford being seen as average, less capable than their male counterparts, and they got no special treatment either. With the PO2's limited space, the generals denied them parachutes, so there would be more room for that second bomb. So they had to be scrappy. Using just a compass and a handheld map to guide them, they flew missions in complete darkness. No radars, no radios. And so with little to rely on but their planning, mapping, and timing, The 588th managed to strike a new kind of fear into the hearts and minds of the German soldiers. These women weren't simply proving they could fly in battle, they were proving women are just as capable to fight for their home as men. Now, despite being decried by the mostly male Soviet Air Force as just inexperienced little girls looking to play soldier, some of them were teaching those very men how to fly before the war even started. In fact, let me tell you about one of them. Meet Nadezhda Popova. She became a flight instructor at just 19 years old. She then lost both her home and her brother at the front line in 1941, and soon joined the 588th Regiment. She would go on to fly 852 combat missions over the course of the war, more than any pilot in her regiment. In fact, after one such mission, she returned to base camp with shredded wings and 42 bullet holes in her aircraft, in her map, and even in her helmet. Yet she kept on flying. Then there's Irina Sabrova, who became an experienced flight instructor at just 23 years old. Born in an impoverished family, she worked as a locksmith and factory worker before being recruited by Marina Ryskova. And despite several close calls during her time in war, including a trading incident that nearly ended her life before she ever saw combat, she would go on to 1,008 sorties in the war, more than any other of the Night Witches. Then there's Commander Yevdokia Bershinskaya. Also hailing from a poor rural village, her extensive experience training dozens of pilots before the war led her to become the leader of the 588th Regiment. Now, under her command, the regiment flew an arduous route from the Rostov region to Germany, helping in the liberation of the North Caucasus, Crimea, and Poland. And when the regiment inflicted such an effective strike against the German artillery positioned in Kremsk near the Black Sea, they were able to force them out entirely from the Taman Peninsula. This victory was so significant, the USSR recognized it by later referring to them as the Taman Guards. Throughout the war, 32 women from the 88th were killed in action. That's 32 out of 400, which actually isn't bad. Other bomber units on average had 2 to 3 times higher the casualties. By the time Germany surrendered in 1945, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had earned its place as one of the most effective and decorated units in the Soviet Air Force. 22 of them were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the USSR could give. So after all the success and decorations, what happened to these women? And why haven't we heard about any of this until recently? Well, after Germany's surrender in 1945, the 588th Regiment was disbanded. Remember that whole serving the needs of the state thing? With the war now over, the ever-practical USSR no longer needed its women to be soldiers. It now needed mothers. And this wasn't exclusive to the USSR. Stalin's government, along with the rest of the world, moved fast to push women back into traditional civilian roles. So those factories that were staffed with women during the war, they were men's jobs now. The positions of authority women held back to men. And the Night Witches, well, despite all their success and decorations, they were excluded from the Victory Day parade in Moscow. Take that as you will, but the official reasons state it was because the PO2s were too slow for the ceremonial fly past. The same planes that, for years, struck the fear into the hearts and minds of Germans. The same planes that were nicknamed after witches. The same planes that earned a soldier an Iron Cross if they shot it down. Those planes were too slow to fly over Moscow. Can you imagine that just for a second? You've spent years fighting. You've seen your friends die. You've earned one of the highest awards in the Soviet Union. And now you're not even allowed to show your success in a parade meant to spark pride and joy in the nation. Most of them went back to civilian life. Some became teachers, some became engineers, some got married and had children. They just returned to normal life. One of them, Irina Rakobovskaya, said this years later. During war, bringing women into aviation was justified. In peacetime, women can only fly for sport. But in truth, they had always known whatever glory they achieved would be short-lived.
Far from naive, they knew the terms of the deal before it even started. And so for decades, most of the world never even knew they existed. Occasionally, they got a passing mention in Soviet history. That is, if they were even mentioned at all. They weren't just omitted from the history books. They were omitted from memory, forgotten. But in the 1990s and 2000s, things started to change. Serious historical work began to recover their incredible stories. This was mostly sparked by the fall of the Soviet Union, which finally allowed the release of previously hidden information to spread beyond the Iron Curtain. Historians spent years digging through all of the archives, even conducting interviews with the few surviving night witches. And over time, their stories were pieced together. Museums began creating exhibits, documentaries were made. Veterans like Nadezhda Popova spent their later years giving interviews, sharing her memories so the world would finally know the truth, making sure we remembered them. And now, finally, we do. The last known survivor of the Night Witches, navigator Galina Brok-Beltsova, died in 2024, marking the end to a historic moment whose enormous impact is no longer forgotten. The Night Witches didn't win the war by themselves, but their diligence, intellect, and love for their country helped to win one of the largest military operations known in history. Their wooden planes have long since turned to dust, but the sound that haunted the nights of so many along the Eastern Front still echoes in history. Come to think of it, we can now say the Night Witches fought and won 3 wars. The fight to be allowed to fight, their fight against the Germans, and the fight to be remembered. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to share the knowledge with your friends and hit subscribe. It really helps the channel. But in the meantime, what's a lesser known story about World War II we should uncover next? Let us know.